Well, hell yeah. Welcome to the Center for Indigenous Midwifery's podcast. Our mission is strengthening community by honoring, supporting, and reclaiming Indigenous midwifery care and culturally centered family support. For more information on our programming, visit indigenous-midwifery.org, find us on social media, or tune in for a live Zoomcast offered each month. Thank you so much for listening.
Okay, well, thank you all for being here. I just want to take a moment to introduce myself. Osio, Dawadoa, Montana. I'm learning a little bit of Cherokee. I'm Cherokee and Choctaw Native. I'm also Ilocano Filipino. I'm wearing my Indipino shirt. And I'm also mixed European. And yeah, I started being involved with Canoe Journey Herbalists a couple years ago. I actually found them on Instagram during the migrant caravan, and that they were like reaching out looking for herbal donations. And I am kind of on a funny path of reclaiming my herbalism from the indigenous roots, but I was trained in Western herbalism. So I was like, oh, I want to help. And that just led to signing up for the Indigenous herbal pathways and just, keep showing up and being a part of WHAM for a while. And then Rhonda was my midwife for my second baby, my son, who's actually going to be 2 next week, which is wild. So for me, like, I grew up somewhat related to more to my Cherokee side than my Choctaw side. And my grandfather, my mom's mom, was put into foster care. So, our lineage was broken in that way. And it's so much of a story for a lot of us that are Indigenous, but awkwardly, like trying to connect, and we don't always know where to start, and we don't always know how or what is appropriate, or all of that can be really hard. And that's definitely been my journey. And that's part of why I'm really excited to the First Foods for Pregnancy and Postpartum ebook, because for me, having children, becoming pregnant really inspired me to want to learn more so I can pass it on to my kids. And I always get a little bit emotional talking about that because it's just so important and so dear to me, and really just like the why behind, like, like when I feel really weird and like I don't feel comfortable, or like it's, like, am I supposed to be here? I go through imposter syndrome. It's like, yes, like I am. And like, I need to for my kids so that they get to have like their roots and they don't just get lost. And yeah, I had 2 home births. They were healthy and safe and like the best I could have asked for. Rhonda was at my second one, and it was just an incredible birth. It was pretty wild. She was able to, my baby wanted to come out like this and do the elbow tear thing, and she was able to just like hold him still to come out, and he had his cord around his neck and she shimmied his cord down. And like I just love, I didn't even actually know that was happening. She was such an amazing midwife in that it was, it was just in the seconds. I was in the birth pool. I think I said something like, he wants to go back in, because I felt like he was coming down, and then it just felt like he didn't want to come all the way out. And she had me, I was in like the kind of like kneeling position, and she had me kind of go back onto my back. My husband was in the pool onto him, and Rhonda just did it. She just like shimmied it all down in the moment, at that one last push, and he was out. And it's still such an amazing thing to think about for me, because it could have been a very different situation in terms of like a tear and sutures and potentially like hospital stuff. He because he had the cord wrapped around, he had he was a little bit gray and blue, and I didn't actually really register that yet. I just kind of sucked his mucus out and spit it, and taught me actually with my daughter. But then Rhonda also came in, without making like a big fuss, just so seamlessly, and put the little oxygenate thing on, and he just took a breath and he was fine. He was fine. And we had a very funny entrance, but a great like smooth ride for the rest of it. And we also did a lotus birth, which is where you don't cut the cord at all. And I would love to talk about that more at some point. But yeah, we did that with my daughter and my son. And I don't know if you all know who Robin Lim is, but Robin Lim wrote a really beautiful book called The 12th Chakra, I think. Um, and it's about lotus birth. And so it has a lot of, it's very common like in all parts of the world, but it has like, it's some indigenous roots in the Philippines too. And that's Robin Lim is Filipino. And so learning about that was like kind of like my first aspect of like reclaiming my indigenous roots. Um, this time to the Philippines, and doing lotus birth was such a beautiful and wild, like kind of like a first rites of passage. I mean, aside from birth, for the baby, and just to allow that cord to kind of like dry. And it seemed like each day, and it takes about 3 to 9 days, depending on the baby. Both my babies were, there were 4 and then 5, no, 3 and then 4 days. And it was like every day that the cord seemed to get drier, the baby's eyes got like clearer and wider. And it was really beautiful to feel like it was like the first aspect of like gentle arrival in this world, of just like the cord shriveling and the baby's like coming, it like its spirit's like really landing. And um yeah, then with my daughter, I really struggled. I had pretty severe postpartum depression. I didn't know anything about breastfeeding. I didn't know what foods I should be eating, just that I'm supposed to be apparently eating more than when I was pregnant. And I knew I should be drinking water, but I just didn't know how hard it is to have a baby. And I had pretty low milk supply, and she had a tongue tie, and that was, it was traumatic. We didn't get it revised till she was a week old, and so my milk supply just never really came in. And then family has low milk supply. It was something that like if I had been aware of and knew how to handle it, I probably could have gotten on top of it. But I tried my best. I tried taking some supplements, and eventually just she was fortunately able to have a lot of donor milk, but it was definitely hard. And all of that really prepared me for my second baby, my son. And we intentionally conceived him. I knew I wanted 2 babies, and I was like, okay, well, this time I'm gonna have like my lactation consultant on call. I'm gonna have a craniosacral therapist on call. Like I was so much more versed in herbs and foods and like what you need to breastfeed well and postpartum, and having been really intensely postpartum depressed, like I like had all these like herbs on hand and like what I'm gonna prepare it. And we like hired someone to be able to come help so that it wouldn't just be a surprise. And sure enough, with my son, things were a lot easier going, but I also felt more prepared. I did have a lactation consultant come. It was just really funny because they were actually the first people I told when the baby was born. They came and met the baby, like other than the people that were there, like the very next day. And he didn't have a tongue tie, which was just a huge relief. So it was like, okay, that's one giant thing we don't have to go through. But I was prepared to go through it this time. And I was already like, I'm going to be proactive. I know, like I had a lower milk supply, and this time I made just enough for Nikki. My son, he was growing, and a lot of that was just like mitigated with food and with herbs, and like what does your body really need to make sustained milk and sustained just like hormones and heal well. And that's this last journey and being part, and also I had such a huge community. This last time I was like part of the Canoe Journey Herbalist. Like I was, had a lot of people that were willing to hold the baby to help and had so much knowledge, and got to eat more foods that were traditional and just like I knew my body liked. I knew my body responded well to. And it's been really inspiring to learn about how traditional foods can play a role in just like that postpartum experience and breastfeeding experience. And like having, these foods are, I like to use the word plant ancestor, like they know us, and they know our DNA, and they've been with us for however many millennia. And yeah, so that's been kind of my journey with like why I'm so invested in herbs and food as medicine. It's just really, really helped me and our family. And it's something I'm really passionate about. I've been really enjoying teaching like postpartum herbalism classes and um, you know, like helping with people like conceiving and fertility and pregnancy. And like there's just so much that I think is lost in that regard of just like not just, I don't know, like our traditional foods as medicines too, and our traditional herbs as medicines and weaving them. And one of my passions is making food really fun and kind of like I love to make herbal and herbal desserts, and I'm gluten-free and dairy-free. For me, one of my traditional foods is coconuts. And so like using coconut milk in place of like heavy cream and playing with food in that way has been really fun. And it's been really fun to like make cornbread, which has been just like a traditional food forever, but make it gluten-free and make it so like I can just like feel really good eating like 4 pieces and not get a headache and stuff. And like this is all just like for my body and my family's what works for us. But I love to like think of our foods and find new ways to play with them because it's so important to create recipes that or to tweak them to make it a little bit more like palatable for our individual bodies. If we know like the one thing makes us feel kind of off, or I don't know, I've just really been enjoying tuning in to the body on like a subtle level and seeing like, oh, like I really like sweet things, but I can't actually do refined sugar, so I get a headache. So I play around with like coconut sugar, maple syrup, and things like that. But it can still make the yummy things that like we enjoy, like still have ice creams and still have like cornbreads, and how to take like we made a cedar ice cream and things like that, and playing with the traditional foods in a yummy way. It's just been really fun for everyone to enjoy them in new ways, but also just have those old flavors that we all know and those old medicines. And that kind of brings me into like the cookbook, which is less of a cookbook now. I don't know if you all know, we're working on through the Center of Indigenous Midwifery a first foods for pregnancy and postpartums, traditional foods for pregnancy and postpartums. And so we're asking people to like, if they feel comfortable, to like send us recipes of like, people have sent in atoles, and people have sent in the Banchi stews, and all sorts of from all the different nations. And I can only speak a little bit on my Cherokee and Choctaw nations, and it's just been a really awkward and intense process to work on the book as someone who's actively reclaiming like my indigeneity, and feels awkward, but it's just such good medicine doing it, because I would so appreciate having had something like this when I had my first baby and I was struggling and didn't know where to start. And I know so many people, especially like urban natives, just might not have the same connection and to like our ancestry that some of us have. And having just like a place to start can be really, really helpful. And just being like, oh, I can try this, or like in my case, like milk making, we did a whole page on milk making and recipes for to help promote milk and help like milk flow, and just like all these tips and like drinks that we can make or little snacks that we can make that encompass our traditional foods. And just having those kinds of things on hand can make a really big deal when you're like sleep deprived, with a new baby, or you're supporting someone who's sleep deprived with a new baby and they're not able to think very well, or to, the access like the knowledge that they might even have themselves, but maybe just gets, with all the stimulation isn't as easy to draw upon, and having it. And we're turning into like kind of an online archive can be a little more accessible for folks. So I've been working on that for the last couple of months, And it's just been a wild and beautiful process of really diving into first realizing like how researching is can be like really coded with white supremacy, and like there aren't great native sources of native foods, and really the best thing we can do is reach out to individuals and have like the awkward like, hey, can I interview you? Fortunately we have like such a beautiful community, and that's really what it is too, is like being in relationship and like creating community members and creating bonds of trust where people feel safe to like share recipes and share like ways of preparing foods and how we worked with these foods. And maybe it's like we just have a food that someone else like carries the knowledge of how our bodies in pregnancy and postpartum and breastfeeding and other places too, right? But yeah, it's been a really interesting and awkward and beautiful journey, just kind of uncovering that. And I feel really adept at like kind of like naming like what foods carry which nutrients, and like that's something like I was trained in. But as far as like learning individual recipes from other nations, like that's more of just me like out there just trying to find people who are willing to uh, share what they feel comfortable with for these archives. Again, it all just comes back to like the future generations of like people where we've been like disconnected, some of us, me especially, for however many years or generations, and trying to do that reclamation like almost very blindly, like okay, like my people once ate this food, like how did they eat it? I have no idea, and it's like I can try and play around and see how I eat it, and that's can be really helpful and can also be really fun. And also it really helps knowing like how it was actually traditionally prepared, and it can like save a lot of time. And it's like yeah, just like learning like the like with corn, like it's important to nixtamize it and things like that. And yeah, just like all of these ways that like our original peoples like worked with these foods and plants and knew from our indigenous scientific knowledges, just like how they really want to work with our bodies. And that's a lot of what I've been learning and trying to put together for these pages for the cookbook. Slash it's really it's not really going to be a cookbook, it's more going to be like an online archives database of traditional first foods and pregnancy and postpartum.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for sharing. I find it very interesting when you talk about like there has to be like a little bit of reinventing, because none of these relationships is supposed to be static, like it's a
Right.
constant transformation. And I really like thinking about getting creative with like the gluten-free, dairy-free traditional foods and mixing all of it together. I was wondering if you could
Yeah.
talk a little bit about the the traditional foods in terms of introducing them to babies, and
Yeah.
also like the way that it affects the postpartum recovery and the milk production.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I think I mean it's really such a special thing to make. I think I don't know what Western world says to feed your babies for the first time, like gruel or something, or like oatmeal, I don't know. But a baby's like very first food, it's so special because it's like their very first taste of like the world, aside from what they've gotten in our milk. And even eating like our traditional foods while we're making milk like gives them those flavors subtly, to prime their palates. We're in like Coast Salish lands, and salmon's like what my husband grew up here. He grew up in I live in Kitsap County on Suquamish land, and he has lived here his whole life, and so was like, oh, we should give them salmon. And we gave them just like tiny, like you can really piece it up like morsely. So it's just like actually literally a little tiny morsel, and like almost like the size of a fingernail clipping, and just gave them that. And you can't choke on it. Our babies were 4 months old when they had their first taste of food, and many babies go 6 months or even later, and it really depends. 4 months is kind of the minimum, and again, that's because I'm a low producing person, so we just went with it. And we were working a lot with bone broths, and like all of us, I mean, most Indigenous people ate meat, and whether they were like eating deer, eating buffalo, or eating rabbits, or eating even in fish broths too, and all the different ways of like that meat comes into like our bodies. You can make a broth with it, and broths are really great for babies' first foods. And you can use that to like kind of mush the food. Like if you wanted to feed your baby sweet potato, you could do a sweet potato with like a little bit of broth, and just kind of like mush it in and make it, we gave my daughter a lot of avocado and broth, and that was what she really loved. And my son didn't really like avocado. I'm trying to remember. We gave him a lot of sweet potato and broth, but broth being just like to just like nourish their bellies and create like really great flora for breaking, just for their intestines and for their stomachs, and breaking down foods, and just kind of inoculating with like really great stuff. But also like that first food aspect too, of like they're not ready to like eat meat or full on stews, but they can have broths, they can have like little bits. And it also really helps with their immunities too. And so if once they're like, again, like 4 months plus, like doing like broth, sometimes we would cut broth and nettle tea, we'd mix them together like in the bottle. My son, I breastfed him exclusively for about 2 months, and I supply started again. I had a lot more things. I kept it like definitely way more than I did with my daughter, but still not enough to quite sustain him. So we would sometimes cut like his bottle. We got some donor milk, and we would cut that with some broth. Not a lot, like maybe like a quarter broth and 3/4 milk, because you definitely want to make sure they're getting their fat content. But it was just really beautiful. He loved it. He loved the taste of the broth, and it was nourishing him, and it has proteins in it, and it has minerals in it, and it has like really great things for little tiny growing bodies and for us too. And some of the foods, traditional foods while making milk, definitely like atoles, corns, like forages in that way of like corn as like hominy, and having those kinds of like stews really help. Oatmeal really helps. It's not like a native first food, but it really helps a lot with milk making. And so you can kind of mix it too. You could do like part oats and part hominy or cornmeals, and that way it's again it's like learning to play with like having our traditional foods. Maybe we can't have like it all just be the one food. Maybe we play with it and play with ratios, but we just get our foods in there too, and just gives our body like a little bit of boost of like knowing these plants, and like knowing that they've worked for like our genetics for however many millennia. And nettles is really great. I'm sure, I know Elizabeth Montez spoke about nettles on her Zoomcast for breastfeeding, and I interviewed her, and she was the one who told me how nettles works by basically increasing choline, and choline allows the milk to flow well. So something that you might see in stores that I always thought was a good idea, but learned from Elizabeth, is sunflower lecithin, and it's just like this byproduct of sunflower seeds, and it's supposed to be really good for thinning milk. But Elizabeth was telling me that sunflower lecithin can thin milk, but then also clog it afterwards. So especially for people that overproduce or just trying to get clogs out, or like mastitis, using like working with nettles and having there's so many ways to have nettles, and I can go over that in a second. But nettles actually creates more choline, and that helps just thin it and like increase blood supply. And it's great because nettles are everywhere. They're so sustainable, and especially for those of us in the Pacific Northwest, you can just go out and pick them and pick tons and have some. You can make nettle pestos. You can make nettle tea. It doesn't only have to be tea though. I actually made a nettles moss cake, and it was called a moss cake because it looked like moss, but it didn't have moss in it. And it was delicious. It tastes like regular cake, but it was so full of nettles. And you can like puree the nettles like how you would make like a carrot cake, and make like a nettles cake. So there's just like all these ways to have the foods that are fun too, and not just like only tea and only, like tea is great. And I drink tea all the time. I'm literally drinking tea, but but it's, especially when we're talking about kids and getting kids to eat things, or elders, or people that just like want things to taste yummy and want to reach for things that, if you're craving something sweet while you're breastfeeding, which is good to have on hand, lots of little snacks, you can have them with your foods in it and still get that craving met without necessarily having something that might spike your blood sugar too much, or might just like, make you not feel that well, or might make you feel kind of a little too energized if you're trying to sleep, or things like that. And nettles are really great for milk supply. Really, really great. Definitely making sure that you're getting enough healthy fats. So for those that eat fish, where fishes are our traditional foods, or if we're in a place that has really great fish supply, fish is so wonderful in terms of like the high fat content, and it's really great for promoting like fattier milk, especially if you're having like an undersupply. And then just like making sure you're getting those fats enough. So whether that's putting like just like a spoonful of like, I don't do dairy, so I don't do butter, and I don't, but for people that do butter, or if you do olive oil, or if you do coconut oil, or if you do ulican grease, was a traditional food, like having like some of that in your soups, like on your rice dishes. Rice is another great one, the wild rice. So from like the Anishinaabe lands and those peoples, it's a really great one for milk supply, and just like that healthy kind of like iron rich grain that like you could make like a morning rice porridge with that, and then do like part of that, like adding like your fat in it. Like you put berries with it. You can make it sweet if you wanted to. It sounds funny because it's traditionally like not necessarily a sweet thing, but learning how to, like we do quinoa breakfast bowls at my house. And so we'll cook quinoa with like partial, oat milk because non-dairy, and partial water, and then put berries in it, and nuts and spices like cinnamon and cardamom, and cook it down. And it's like a replacement for oatmeal. So it's a little more protein rich and like a little less blood sugar spiking, because, Native Americans, that's always going to be a thing. And it just gets that same kind of like taste profile, but is a little more tailored to brown bodies. And does that answer, Marissa, about like breastfeeding and first foods?
Yeah, it does. And I was thinking about a couple different things about what you said. One of them was you were mentioning about like some of the foods being like traditional against I don't know, colonizer food. But I also think about how ourselves, like I'm mixed, and I think a lot of people are mixed, and also just kind of like wondering about making space to bring in like different wisdoms from different ancestors. That's one thing that came to mind when I was wondering about that. And then the other thing, when I was hearing you talk about nettles, I know that people that listen to the podcast and like watch the Zoomcast might be in lots of different places, and I wonder how do you go about starting to discover these like new foods that maybe are not the foods that you find in the supermarket, because I don't know if you're for instance in Arizona, there won't be a bunch of nettles, and there might be
Yeah.
it might be a little challenging. I think when I was living in
Yeah.
Texas, like kind of like looking around and being like, okay, how do I find which foods are gonna be like adapting to the different environments, and like honoring my different ancestors, and kind of just like going through like this whole path when you go into different environments. And I was
Yeah.
wondering, like I get a little clarity around how it went for you, but what kind of advice would you have for someone that is starting on this journey and not exactly knowing where to go, other than just like the supermarket that they have been shopping at all their whole life?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And it's really relevant because again, like we chose to give like our babies like little bits of salmon because we're in like the land of salmon. And it felt right for that to be like the very first food that touched their lips. And we were planning on living here, but I'm not from the Pacific Northwest, and like I didn't grow up here, but I also like don't have Pacific Northwest Indigenous blood in me. But I mean, that's such a good question. And I can only offer my own experience. And for me, this is where it is beautiful to be like living in this day and time and age. Like, as much as I think that sometimes we're like overconnected with like the internet and stuff, it's a great resource. It's a great place to start. And like this community is a great place to start because I'm sure someone knows someone who's Indigenous and like in Texas. If we're using like the example of Texas, because I wouldn't know. I would like literally reach out to like my person that I know that I can pick up the top of my head. I was like, oh, I would probably ask like my friend Monica, and because she's in New Mexico and maybe she knows someone in Texas because she's in the Southwest. So she probably knows like maybe someone, and maybe she knows someone who knows someone. And I think it's like such a beautiful way of like having like the intersection of the internet for community. And that is again like how I found the Canoe Journey Herbalist is like, I don't even know how I started following them or what, but I did on Instagram, and then I was following them and I saw that they had a need and I was like, oh, that's amazing. And then a few years later, I'm still involved, like loosely, like following them, going to events, and I see that they're doing these weekly work as medicine, which they're not doing anymore, but things every Tuesday. And I was like, oh, I want to, bring and they were all ages, and it's like, I want to bring my kids, like we can go be involved. And through that, like meeting people, like meeting more Indigenous people, like just going to these funny events, finding them, creating connections, and then you're creating relationships and learning through that, and like learning slowly. And it is awkward and it's strange because like I could say, oh, go to farmers markets, and that can be a great place to start. Just go to farmers markets, see what is available, see what is local. But honestly, like we don't have like just Indigenous farmers markets yet, so it can be more awkward than that, and it can take longer. And like you can just start with what you know and start with what you have access to, and that's like the best thing you can do. It's better than not doing anything. And it is very, like, I'm not gonna lie, it's very awkward. Like I've definitely cried a lot, and I probably will honestly after this, because it always makes me really reflect on this about how like my journey is different than like other people's journeys. It's slow. It's so much slower. It's like learning, like it's 5 years since like, oh wow, like we did this. And like like now I can introduce myself. It took me years to learn how to just say like, hello, welcome, my name is this, like in my traditional language. And so reclamation and learning about foods is so important and so integral. And very few people are, the more that we can learn, like pass on to our generations, it's going to keep it alive. And that definitely starts with just relationship building and just being awkward and being willing and understanding it's going to be like a slow journey. And maybe it won't be. Maybe you'll meet someone and they'll just be like, yeah, I just do this and I eat this, and it's like cool. And that does happen, and that's great when it happens. But just having that awareness that like that might happen, and also it might just be slow and awkward, and it's like part of our, I don't know, it's part of our like reclamation path as like contemporary natives.
Yeah,
I
thank
don't know
you
if that's a good
for
answer.
that. Yeah, no, I hear you on a lot of these things, and stumbling, like doing some stumbling.
It's a lot of
And being
stumbling.
being willing to be in that vulnerable stumbling place. When I was thinking about this I kept on thinking about sometimes it's like reconnecting with like a specific plant can be a good place to start. Um,
Mhm.
like one of the things that I'm really happy about is I was able to bring this plant, epazote, which we
Oh,
use a lot in Mexico, and I got like seeds and I adapted them to the Pacific Northwest. So now I have a pasote in my house, and it's just like sometimes even just smelling it. I don't even need to cook with it. Just like smelling
yeah.
it, like, it's so
Yeah,
nice.
no,
It smells like
I
home.
I think that's like so like such a beautiful place to start too. And I did that too. I got again more for my Filipino side, we have shatavari, which or some people say shatavari, but it's actually a type of asparagus. And I found some online and I just planted it in my sunniest spot. And it's growing, it's not in like the humid Philippines. um, but it's and it's not, yeah, I don't plan on ever being able to harvest it because it's just one little plant, but it's just nice to have our plants in whatever way, whether they're just like our pot plants or I think of that too of like, you know, most of us use sage to smudge, and specifically more so with my white friends, I'm like always asking, well, like your people often use rosemary in the same way. And it's like, and like in native peoples, we all have like those, like some people use sweetgrass more, or some people use cedar here, especially more, and having like whatever those plants are, like whether they're lavender or, just having like, and I was thinking too about what you're saying about being mixed, and like I'm mixed, and most of us these days are mixed. And I think you don't have to really choose, like finding that way of like what you're saying with the foods, like of you can like bring them all in and have them all like work with your body, and having that way too with like the plants that you grow. Like maybe you're growing corn and maybe you're growing berries, and like most of us have traditional foods as berries, and maybe you're also growing, like I'm growing milky oats right now, which is the oat plant. I'm growing it because it really, really helps me with my mentality. And it's definitely a food from like my European peoples, but it like grows well here, and it's not like a colonizer plant. It's not like completely taking over like blackberries do and some other plants. And kind of listening like, well, and like dandelion. Dandelion's a really great plant, and it's it's here, it's sustainable, you can grow it, it's not going to take over. And listening to like how that can be in balance, and like the foods operating in that way and teaching us, I think is really beautiful too.
Yeah, I
I
completely.
wanted to say that.
Yeah, yeah, and just like allowing the things to get mixed up, and I think is beautiful.
Yeah.
Because yeah, like I was just thinking about that, about like making more space for the wisdom of, and now I'm thinking about this much, and I'm like, can we like make like a combination that will honor our traditional plants for or specific heritage that will be like a good thing to smudge with in our house, like the personalized one.
Yeah. 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 And I mean, in that way, like, I don't know, I think starting sometimes with the internet can be really helpful, just learning like plants that lived in your nations, wherever
Mhm.
they're from, and starting there. And then you can eventually find, like recipes with those plants. And maybe it's a long time till you find someone that can like teach you a traditional recipe that they've held in their family.
Yeah.
But it's at least better, it's closer to nothing, like learning like, oh, like Cherokee foods are, we ate corn, we ate deer, we ate berries, and we obviously ate corn differently than like the Mexican peoples eat corn, very
Mhm.
different places. But it's still just like anytime I have corn, it feels like sacred, even if it's a different way than like my ancestors prepared the corn. It's still like at least getting that food in and starting. I don't know. I just like, yeah, learning the recipes is really beautiful and really sacred, and definitely a stumbling journey. But sometimes just even having access to the foods, like knowing and starting with like learning what our foods were that we ate traditionally. And I think you're right. Like part of like our ancestors learned, they weren't the same from like, like millions of years ago to hundreds of years ago. Like they changed and they adapted. And if they were here, now they would be adapting their foods too. They would be like using, like making them quicker and yummier and things like that. Like that's part of like the beauty, I think, of being in this time, of being able to play with things a little bit more. And yeah.
If there was like one little step that people could take towards like integrating some of these foods like today, what do you think could be something?
Yeah, well, I think, okay, so so which foods?
Well, traditional foods. I'm just thinking about like sometimes people want to get started on this journey and it just feels like what's like sometimes things can feel really big, so like if we break them
Yeah.
down into like a very very small doable
Okay.
thing.
Yeah. Well, one of my friends recently said, like, if you can try and get a traditional food in your body in whatever way, maybe you can't have traditional foods every single meal. That might just be like inconceivable and inaccessible and especially, if you have a family and you're just trying to get by, but maybe it's like once a day or one day a week, you make like one, even like a side is like a traditional food. And again, it can be like starting with something simple. Just I always think like simple is best. And if you're, excuse me, like making like cornbread as like a side of a food, or if you're making a stew and you put in like your traditional meat like in the stew, and then you do use like all the regular things, like use potatoes and carrots and onions and garden spices, but you have that one part of the stew is like your food, and it gets like these new things with it, but that's not like taking away from like the sacredness and like the juiciness of that food going into your body. So I think it's really just like, yeah, like finding ways to adapt it to your lifestyle of what makes for people, what is accessible. Maybe it's like making a tea before bed and having like, yeah, like a nettles tea, or having an atole before bed, or having just like having berries, having your traditional berries just like in a morning, yeah, oatmeal or quinoa breakfast bowl or whatever, or a rice bowl, like trying that like on a weekend when you have a little bit more space, if you have more, whatever day you have more space in, trying to just be like, okay, I'm gonna like pick a food, and even if it's not your traditional recipe, like you can research like, okay, I want to work with wild rice today, like how can I eat it, and just find like a way to make it. And then if like the next week or the next month, whatever it is, like find a new way to make it, find a new way to, and then eventually you can find like, if it makes, as you keep working with it too, like the rice will tell you like how it wants to be cooked. You'll be like, oh, it's like a little too soft, or this recipe doesn't work, or this recipe feels more right. And like a lot of that is like our bodies just like responding to the foods, and like we have like an intelligence that still exists, and a relationship to these plants that still exists. It's just learning how to be in relationship again with them. It's stumbling, it's awkward.
Mhm.
I hope
Uh,
that's helpful.
about the cookbook, if anybody has any recipes that they want to share, or if they want to stay updated about like what's going on with it, because it's not available yet, right? Like the archive.
No, we're working on finishing up the first 4 pages of it to be available, and then we have a bunch of pages that we're currently, we made like 30 something pages, and now we're just like redoing the structure to make it like a little bit easier on the eyes.
Mhm.
And it's going to be, Rhonda decided that she wanted an archive because she wants it to be dynamic as well, and like a living thing. And like as people learn about, like there's only so much that like we hold and this community holds. And as the community grows, as more people learn about it, we can update it too and be like, oh, actually, like nettles can also do this now. And we can add it to there for, so it'll be like, we'll release the pages that we have pretty soon, the first 4 pages, and then they'll just also be like a growing thing, and eventually all be online. I imagine that you'll get access to it through the newsletter.
Mhm.
definitely asking Rhonda, emailing Center for Indigenous Midwifery if you want to contribute. We're always looking for people to contribute and pass the word along. Yeah.
To contribute specifically recipes?
Recipes, or if you were like just even being like, we use this food for postpartum hemorrhage, or for this was a food we gave babies for colic, or these are just things like if you knew that you also worked with a food for a certain way. We're just looking for that, for if people want to contribute, if they feel comfortable. And it won't ever be something that's just like widespread to like the public. It'll be kept for like the Center for Indigenous Midwifery and Canoe Junior Herbalists and for Indigenous folks. But yeah, it's just kind of like an ongoing archive that people will be able to access in their awkward reclamation journeys and in their postpartums, and just like that time, just having cookbooks and having that is something I actually do a lot. I don't really read a lot of I have one physical cookbook, but I have a lot of saved tabs on my computer with recipes, and that's like a primary way that can be really easy, and just go to it and pull it up on your phone and make a recipe, and enough times you learn it by heart. But it can be a really great fun way to start.
Well, thank you so much, Montana. Thank you everyone for being here, and thank you, Montana, for sharing about these.
Yeah, Wedo Yokoke Salamat. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening, and I hope it was helpful and interesting.